Okay, so have you ever heard of an entire national economy just completely hitting a wall on the verge of collapse, only to suddenly flip around like overnight? Well, today we're diving into exactly that story. It's a pretty stunning economic turnaround that happened under the most unbelievable circumstances. I mean, just look at this. It's night and day. Before 1967, you've got an economy in an absolute freefall. We're talking a severe recession, total economic paralysis. And then boom, almost instantly, the whole picture flips. You get this explosive, unprecedented growth. The change is so dramatic, it almost doesn't seem real. And that right there is the big question. What on earth could be a powerful enough trigger to act like a switch? Flipping an entire economy from a dead stop to full throttle. All right, let's dig in and figure it out. Okay, so to really understand just how big this boom was, we first have to get a feel for the bust that came before it. So let's rewind a bit back to the mid-1960s. This was a time when this, just cloud of deep economic anxiety was hanging over everything. And listen, we're not talking about some minor dip here. In 65 and 66, Israel was in a severe recession. Economic activity didn't just slow down, it basically ground to a complete halt. It's like the entire country was just frozen in place. The Hebrew term for this is mitaun, which just means recession. But this wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. No, it was driven by something much more powerful, a collective emotion, fear. The whole nation was basically holding its breath, bracing for a potential war with Egypt. And that feeling of dread, it was powerful enough to paralyze the entire economy. And then, in the span of just 6 days, everything changed. This was the turning point, the fulcrum on which the entire economic story was about to pivot. I mean, this timeline really lays it all out, doesn't it? It's like a 3-act play. First, you've got the deep recession of the mid-60s. Then the flashpoint, June 1967, the Six-Day War. And right after that, an economic boom. There's really no question about it. The war was the catalyst. So what did this incredible post-war boom actually look like? Well, it wasn't just one single thing. It was more like a domino effect, a whole bunch of interconnected factors that all came together to ignite the entire economy. Okay, so for starters, that massive psychological weight of an existential threat, it was suddenly lifted. And that created this huge wave of national confidence. That new confidence, well, it helped open the floodgates for tourism. At the very same time, the nation's borders expanded, which opened up entirely new areas for development. And to pour fuel on the fire, the government started making these massive investments in infrastructure, education, and health. But this was so much more than just growth for the sake of growth. What was really happening was that the very DNA of the Israeli economy was being rewritten. And this is where you can really see that fundamental change in action. Before 67, the public sector, the government, pretty much dominated the economy. But after the war, you see this massive surge in the private sector that completely flips the balance. This was a huge moment, a real shift away from a state-controlled model and towards a more market-driven economy. So you might be wondering, how did this shift actually happen? Well, the construction of the Bar-Lev line is a perfect case study. The government needed these huge fortifications built along the new frontier. But, and this is the key part, instead of using government agencies, they hired private companies for the job. And all of a sudden, these private contractors needed to buy trucks, tractors, all sorts of equipment. They had to hire tons of workers. So one single government project ended up kickstarting a whole ecosystem of private business. It created a powerful new engine for growth. And it didn't stop there. This new energy in the private sector also completely changed the kinds of industries that were powering the economy. It was, a shift from the farm to the factory, and eventually way beyond that. See, the pre-war economy was really all about traditional industries, things like agriculture. But after 67, all this new investment, all this new energy, it started getting channeled into more advanced sectors. We're talking about the very beginnings of an economy built on things like electronics and chemicals. And this wasn't just some abstract idea either. You could see it happening in real time with the creation and expansion of huge companies like the Dead Sea Works and Israel Chemicals. And the government was pushing for it too. They were actively encouraging this shift by passing laws to get people to invest privately in these new, more advanced fields. And here's what's so critical to understand. The high-tech powerhouse that we know today, that didn't exist back then, not in its current form. But the infrastructure was being laid. The seeds were being planted. All the investment, the new economic structure, all of it was creating the foundation for what would, decades later, become known as the startup nation. And so that brings us to our final thought. The period after 1967 created this absolute tidal wave of growth that really defined the nation for decades. But it leaves us with a really important question to think about. How does an era of such rapid, such foundational change end up shaping the economic challenges and, of course, the opportunities for the next 50 years?
All right, today we're going to unpack a perfect storm of war, a global crisis, and some, well, pretty disastrous policy choices that sent an entire nation's economy into a total freefall. We're talking about a period that would go down in history as Israel's lost decade.
So, the lost decade. That's what economists call the period between 1973 and 1985 in Israel. It sounds dramatic, right? But what does it actually mean? Well, it was a time of just crushing economic stagnation, a crisis that really brought the country to its knees.
And to really get our heads around this crisis, we've got to go back to the beginning, to a single seismic event in October of 1973. This was the moment that first domino tipped over, and it set off a chain reaction that would go on for more than a decade.
We're talking about the 1973 Yom Kippur War. It was a complete surprise attack, and look, the military and political fallout was obviously huge, but the economic shock was just as immediate and just as devastating. The entire economy, boom, was instantly put on a war footing.
So you've got this perfect storm brewing inside the country. Just think about this for a second. Your defense spending goes through the roof, right? But at the very same time, your production, your trade, it all just grinds to a halt. So you've got way less money coming in, but these massive new bills for the war, what do? Well, the government really only had one choice. Go deep, deep into debt. And that's exactly what happened. The deficit and the national debt just exploded.
But here's the thing, this didn't just stay within Israel's borders. Oh no, this wasn't just a regional conflict. It sent a shockwave across the entire globe, kicking off a crisis that would hit pretty much every developed nation out there.
And you can see that global chain reaction play out right here. Basically, in retaliation for Western support of Israel, the OPEC cartel decided to use oil as a weapon. They slashed production and, get this, quadrupled prices almost overnight. And just like that, the first global energy crisis was ignited.
Now, this created a very specific kind of economic poison. It's called cost-push inflation. So what the heck is that? Well, it means the price of everything starts to go up. Not because people are buying more stuff, but because the basic ingredients of the economy, like oil, are suddenly way, way more expensive. For a country like Israel that has to import its energy, this was an absolutely crippling blow.
Okay, so let's recap. You've got massive war debts piling up at home and a huge global energy crisis hitting you from the outside. The big question is, how did the government respond? Well, this is where a really bad situation turned into an absolute catastrophe. The internal spiral was about to begin.
The government was really caught between a rock and a hard place. On one hand, you've got these insane defense bills and growing social expenses. On the other hand, the economy is shrinking. So, with not nearly enough money coming in to cover the costs, they turned to what is probably the most dangerous solution imaginable. They just started printing more money.
And this is where you see that domino effect in action. Look, printing money to pay your bills, it's not a solution. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire. When you flood the economy with all this new cash, the value of that money just tanks. People aren't stupid. They realize their money is becoming worthless, so prices for everything have to shoot up to compensate. And that, my friends, is the textbook recipe for hyperinflation.
And let's be clear, this wasn't some abstract problem for economists to debate. No way. Hyperinflation had a devastating, real-world impact that tore at the very fabric of society. It hit everyday people, regular businesses. It changed everything.
And here is the absolutely mind-boggling result of that freefall. At its peak in the early 1980s, the annual inflation rate was over 400%. Just try to imagine that. The price of everything, your food, your gas, your rent, more than quadrupling every single year. That was the reality for people.
And this chart really shows you the sheer speed of this thing. It wasn't a gradual increase. It went exponential. You can see it going from something that was high, sure, but maybe manageable in the early 70s, to a completely out-of-control, hyperinflationary nightmare by the early 80s.
And this is the human cost, right? This is why it matters so much.
The money in your paycheck was practically evaporating before you could even spend it. Your life savings, poof, it could become worthless overnight. If you owned a business, how could you possibly plan for the future? You couldn't even plan for next week. It just created this constant gnawing anxiety and a total loss of faith in the entire system.
And it wasn't just hitting individuals either. Entire sectors of the economy were just crushed. Take the kibbutz movement, for example. A lot of their financial model was built on taking out loans. So when hyperinflation hit and interest rates skyrocketed to try and fight it, that entire model just completely collapsed. It kicked off a massive debt crisis that crippled the whole movement.
So, after 12 years of war, global energy shocks, and these disastrous internal policies, the lost decade had pushed Israel's economy right to the edge. The country was literally staring into a complete economic abyss.
Which leaves us with a huge question, doesn't it? A question Israel absolutely had to answer if it was going to survive. When your money is basically worthless and your national debt is massive, how do you save yourself? How do you pull an entire economy back from the brink? And maybe even more important, how do you restore people's faith? Well, that's a story for another time.